If your dad was a Mopar guy, he remembers 1970. He remembers walking into a dealership and seeing something that shouldn't have existed. 3 two-barrel carburetors sitting on top of a 440 cubic inch V8. 7.2 liters of displacement. 390 horsepower. 490 pound-feet of torque. For about $3,500. That's around $28,000 in today's money, for a car that could run 11-second quarter miles. Stock. Off the showroom floor. The Mopar 446 pack was so dominant, so absurdly overpowered for its price point, that it threatened to destroy the entire muscle car market. Not figuratively, literally. It was so good that the other manufacturers couldn't compete, and when you can't compete, you conspire. This is the story of how Detroit killed its own golden era, not because the cars got worse, because one car got too good. So let's set the stage. It's 1969. The muscle car wars have been raging for about 5 years, and things are getting out of hand. Chevrolet's got the 396 and 454. Ford's running the 428 Cobra Jet. Pontiac has the 400 and the 455. Every manufacturer is trying to one-up the others with bigger engines, more power, faster quarter-mile times. The formula was simple. Take your biggest V8, stuff it into your lightest intermediate body, sell it to young guys who wanted to go fast. The target audience was pretty specific, males, 18 to 35, with more testosterone than common sense and just enough money for a car payment. But here's the thing about arms races. They escalate, and by 1969, the escalation was becoming a problem. Insurance companies were starting to notice that these cars were expensive to insure. Safety advocates were making noise. The government was beginning to pay attention. None of that mattered to Chrysler. Not yet, anyway. Chrysler had a problem, and it wasn't regulatory. It was competitive. Their big block 440 was a solid engine, reliable, torquey. Good for 350 horsepower in most applications, but it was losing drag races to Ford's 428 and Chevy's 396. The 440 was a great street engine, but it wasn't a statement. Chrysler needed a statement. The solution came from an unlikely place. Racing, specifically NASCAR. The engineers at Chrysler had been experimenting with multiple carburetor setups for their racing program. The idea was simple. More carburetors meant more air and fuel. More air and fuel meant more power. The problem was packaging. How do you fit multiple carburetors on an engine that was designed for one? The answer was the six-pack. 3 Holley 2-barrel carburetors. The center carburetor was a vacuum secondary unit rated at 350 CFM. It handled everything at normal driving. Cruising, city traffic. Your grandmother could drive it. The 2 outboard carburetors were smaller, 230 CFM each. They were mechanically operated, meaning they only opened when you floored it. When all 3 were flowing, you had 830 CFM of carburation. For context, a single 4-barrel carburetor on a comparable engine might flow 600 to 700 CFM. The six-pack was overkill. Intentional overkill. The engineering logic was actually elegant. At part throttle, you had excellent fuel economy and smooth drivability because only the center carb was working. You could drive it to work every day. But when you needed everything the engine had, those outboard carbs snapped open and the 440 turned into something else entirely. Chrysler rated the engine at 390 horsepower. This was a lie, a deliberate one. The actual output was closer to 410 to 420 horsepower at the flywheel. Chrysler underrated it for 2 reasons. First, insurance. A car rated under 400 horsepower was significantly cheaper to insure than one rated over. Second, competitive advantage. If your competitors think you're making 390 horsepower and you're actually making 420, you win a lot of races against cars that should be even. The underrating was an open secret. Everyone who worked on these cars knew. The magazines knew. The guys at the drag strip definitely knew. Nobody said anything because everybody benefited from the fiction. But horsepower was only part of the equation. The real magic was in the torque curve. 490 pound-feet at 3,200 RPM. That's a huge number at a low engine speed. It meant the six-pack pulled hard right off idle. You didn't have to rev it to feel the power. It was just there all the time, waiting. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do deep dives like this every week. All right, back to it. The 446 pack debuted in 1969 in the Dodge Super Bee and Plymouth Roadrunner. These were Chrysler's budget muscle cars. No frills, basic interiors, bench seats, rubber floor mats. The whole point was to keep the price low, so the performance-to-dollar ratio was insane, and it was insane. A 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner with the 446 pack cost about $3,500. A comparable Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 cost closer to $4,000. The Ford Torino Cobra 429 was in the same range, but neither of them could match the six-pack's combination of street manners and strip performance. The magazines went crazy. Car and Driver ran a Roadrunner, six-pack, through the quarter mile in 13.5 seconds at 104 miles per hour. Stock, with street tires. Motor Trend got similar numbers. Hot Rod magazine called it the best performance value in America. The racing results were even more impressive. In superstock drag racing, where the rules required largely stock vehicles, the six-pack cars were dominating. They were beating cars that cost twice as much. They were beating cars with more cubic inches. They were beating everything. And that was the problem. See, the muscle car market worked because there was competition. Ford guys bought Fords. Chevy guys bought Chevys. Mopar guys bought Mopars. The rivalry drove sales. People bought cars partly because they wanted to beat the other brand. The tribalism was good for business. But when one manufacturer starts winning everything, the tribalism breaks down. Why would you buy a Chevelle when the Roadrunner is faster and cheaper? Why would you buy a Torino when you're just going to lose at the strip? Ford and General Motors noticed. Their muscle car sales were softening. The six-pack was eating their lunch. Here's where it gets interesting. There was no formal conspiracy, no secret meetings in smoke-filled rooms where executives plotted to kill the muscle car. It was more subtle than that. It was a convergence of interests. The insurance industry had been complaining about muscle cars for years. These vehicles were involved in more accidents, more severe accidents than regular cars. The drivers were young and aggressive. The cars encouraged aggressive driving. Insurance claims were through the roof. In 1970, the insurance industry started implementing surcharges specifically for high-performance vehicles. If your car was on the list, and the six-pack was definitely on the list, you paid extra, sometimes a lot extra. A young driver with a six-pack Roadrunner might pay more for insurance in 1 year than the car cost. This was partly about actuarial data. These cars really were involved in more accidents. But it was also about pressure from manufacturers who wanted to slow down the horsepower wars they were losing. Ford and GM had better relationships with the insurance industry than Chrysler did. They had more leverage. Then there was the government. The Clean Air Act of 1970 was coming. Emissions regulations were going to get strict. Catalytic converters would be required by 1975. High-compression engines running on leaded gasoline were going to become illegal. The manufacturers knew this. They'd known for years. The question was when to start the transition away from big block muscle cars and toward emissions-compliant vehicles. Chrysler wanted to wait as long as possible because they were winning. Ford and GM wanted to accelerate the timeline because they were losing. And then there was the general public relations problem. Ralph Nader's book Unsafe at Any Speed had come out in 1965. The safety movement was gaining momentum. Muscle cars were seen as dangerous, irresponsible, the kind of thing young people shouldn't have access to. The manufacturers started making calculations. The muscle car market was maybe 5% of total sales. It was high profile, great for marketing, but it was a niche. If that niche was causing regulatory problems, insurance problems, PR problems, was it worth defending? For Ford and GM, the answer was becoming no. They'd built their muscle car programs to compete with each other. Now that a third party was dominating, the whole enterprise seemed pointless. Chrysler saw it differently. They were finally winning. After years of being the third choice, they also ran. They had the best performance cars in America. The timing couldn't have been worse. 1970 was the peak year. Chrysler sold about 96,000 Roadrunners. The six-pack was available on multiple platforms: the Challenger, the Cuda, the Super Bee, the GTX. The 440 was everywhere, and it was beating everything. Then 1971 happened. General Motors announced they were dropping compression ratios across the board. All their engines would be designed to run on regular unleaded gasoline. This meant lower compression, which meant less power. The 454 dropped from 450 horsepower to 365. The 400 from 365 to 300. Ford followed almost immediately. The 429 Cobra Jet was detuned. The Boss 302 was discontinued. The Boss 429 was already gone. Chrysler had a choice. They could keep building high-compression engines and be the only game in town for performance buyers, or they could follow the industry and detune. They followed. They had to. The insurance surcharges were killing sales. A car nobody could afford to insure was a car nobody could buy. And the emissions regulations were coming regardless of what Chrysler wanted. The 1971 446-pack was still available, but it was different. Compression dropped from 10.5 to 1 down to 8.5 to 1. Horsepower dropped to 330. It was still a fast car, but it wasn't the same car. By 1972, the six-pack was gone entirely. The muscle car era was over. In 3 years, it went from the greatest performance bargain in automotive history to a footnote. The official explanation was emissions and safety regulations. That's what the manufacturers said. That's what the history books usually say. And it's true as far as it goes. The regulations were real. The insurance problem was real. But the timing is suspicious. The regulations that actually required the detuning didn't take full effect until 1975. The manufacturers started detuning in 1971. They had 4 years of runway they didn't use. Why? The cynical answer, and I think the accurate answer, is that Ford and GM saw an opportunity. The regulatory environment gave them cover to kill a market segment they were losing. If muscle cars were going to die eventually anyway, why not accelerate the death while Chrysler was winning? There's no smoking gun. No memo that says, kill the six-pack. But the pattern is clear. The two largest American manufacturers made coordinated decisions to exit a market segment at the exact moment the third largest manufacturer was dominating that segment. The regulations were a convenient excuse for a strategic retreat. Chrysler executives understood what was happening. Tom Hoover, the engineer who led the Hemi and six-pack development programs, said years later that the end came too fast to be purely about regulations. He believed the competition found a way to change the game when they couldn't win it. The technical legacy of the 446-pack is significant, even though the car itself was short-lived. Let's talk about what made it special from an engineering standpoint. The block was cast iron like most engines of the era. The bore was 4.32 inches. The stroke was 3.75 inches. This was a classic big block configuration, over square, meaning the bore was larger than the stroke. Over square engines rev more freely and make peak power at higher RPM. The heads were the standard 440 units, but they were good heads. The ports flowed well for the era. The valves were 2.08 intake and 1.74 exhaust. Not huge by racing standards, but adequate for the power levels involved. The camshaft was a hydraulic unit with 276 degrees of advertised duration. This was aggressive for a street engine, but not radical. It gave the six-pack good top-end power while maintaining reasonable idle quality. You could sit at a stoplight without the engine shaking itself apart. The intake manifold was aluminum, designed specifically for the three-carburetor setup. The center carburetor sat in a depression that isolated it from the outboard units. Each carburetor had its own plenum area before the runners merged. This design helped with fuel distribution, which was always a challenge with multiple carburetors. The carburetors themselves were the heart of the system. The center Holley 4000 series unit was a simple vacuum secondary design. It operated like any normal carburetor. The outboard Holley 2000 series units were smaller and simpler. They had no choke, no accelerator pump, no idle circuit. They were there purely for wide-open throttle operation. The linkage connecting all three carburetors was a work of mechanical art. A progressive linkage system ensured the center carb opened fully before the outboards began to move. Then the outboards opened together, synchronized by an adjustable rod system. Getting this linkage adjusted correctly was critical. Too tight and the outboards would open too early, causing stumbles. Too loose and they wouldn't open fully, costing power. The exhaust system was typical of the era. Cast iron manifolds fed into a dual exhaust with H-pipe crossover. The mufflers were relatively free-flowing for street use, but restrictive by racing standards. Most serious competitors replaced them immediately. The transmission options were either a 4-speed manual or the TorqueFlite automatic. The 4-speed was a new process A833, a heavy-duty unit shared with the Hemi cars. It could handle the torque barely. The TorqueFlite was actually the preferred choice for drag racing because it was faster and more consistent than most drivers could shift. The rear axle was a Dana 60 in most applications, one of the strongest rear ends available in any American car. It was essentially unbreakable in street use. Gear ratios ranged from 3.23 for highway cruising to 4.10 for strip-focused cars. The chassis was the B-body platform shared across Dodge and Plymouth Intermediates. It wasn't sophisticated. Unibody construction with front subframe, torsion bar front suspension, live axle rear with leaf springs. It was designed for comfort and durability, not handling. These cars went fast in a straight line. Corners were optional. The weight distribution was nose-heavy, as you'd expect with a big iron V8 hanging over the front wheels. About 56% front, 44% rear. This helped traction at launch because weight transferred rearward under acceleration. It did not help handling. The whole package weighed about 3,600 pounds, ready to race. That gave a power-to-weight ratio of about 9 pounds per horsepower using the official rating. Using the actual output, it was closer to 8.5 pounds per horsepower. That's in the same territory as much more expensive exotics. The fuel economy was about what you'd expect, around 8 to 10 miles per gallon in enthusiastic driving, 12 to 14 if you kept your foot out of it. At 1970 gas prices of about 35 cents per gallon, this was tolerable. By 1974, when gas hit 55 cents and there were lines at the pumps, it was less tolerable. The insurance situation deserves more detail because it was the true killer. In 1970, a 22-year-old male in a major city might pay $600 to $800 annually to insure a six-pack Roadrunner. That same driver, insuring a standard Roadrunner with a 383 engine, might pay $350 to $400. The surcharge for the six-pack alone was almost the cost of insuring a normal car. For a 20-year-old, the numbers were even worse. Some insurers simply refused to write policies for young drivers in high-performance vehicles. If you were 19 and wanted a six-pack, you might have to register it in your father's name and pretend you didn't drive it. This insurance problem affected all muscle cars, but it hit the Mopar cars especially hard because they were marketed as affordable. A $5,200 Corvette buyer could probably afford the insurance. A $3,500 Roadrunner buyer often couldn't. Chrysler tried to work around this. They offered detuned versions with milder cams and lower compression. They promoted the 383 as a reasonable alternative. They even briefly considered offering the six-pack as a dealer-installed option rather than factory equipment, which might have avoided some of the insurance scrutiny. None of it worked. The muscle car market was collapsing across the industry, and the six-pack was collapsing faster because its buyer base was more price-sensitive. The last true 446-pack cars were built in 1971. By 72, you could still get a 440, but it was a pale shadow of what it had been. By 74, even the base 440 was being strangled by emissions equipment. The cars that survived are worth a fortune now. A numbers-matching 1970 Roadrunner with the six-pack in good condition can sell for over $100,000. The Hemi cars are worth even more. But the six-pack cars have a special place because they represented the democratization of performance. You didn't have to be rich to go fast. The modern relevance of the six-pack story isn't just nostalgia. It's a lesson about how industries manage competition. When one competitor becomes too dominant, the others have incentives to change the rules rather than compete on merit. The muscle car era didn't end because the cars got worse. It ended because the playing field shifted. Regulations, insurance, fuel economy requirements, all real concerns, all conveniently timed to hurt the market leader. We see the same pattern today in technology, in finance, in any industry where competition becomes uncomfortable for incumbents. When you can't win, change the game. Chrysler learned this lesson the hard way. They built the best muscle cars of the era and got punished for it. The 446-pack was proof that engineering excellence doesn't always win. Sometimes politics does. 50 years later, the muscle car is making a comeback. Dodge has the Hellcat and the Demon. 600 horsepower, 700 horsepower, 800 horsepower. Numbers that would have seemed insane in 1970. But it's different now. The new cars cost $70,000 or more. They're not accessible the way the six-pack was accessible. A working-class kid in 1970 could walk into a dealer and drive out with 390 horsepower. A working-class kid today cannot do the equivalent. The six-pack era was unique. A perfect storm of cheap gas, loose regulations, manufacturer competition, and accessible pricing. It lasted maybe 5 years. And it ended not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. If your father had one of these cars, he probably still talks about it. He's not exaggerating. It really was that good. And it really was taken from him by forces that had nothing to do with what made a good car. The 446-pack wasn't killed by better technology. It was killed by better politics. So that's the story. 3 carburetors, 390 official horsepower, 3 years of dominance, and a conspiracy of convenience that ended the greatest era in American automotive history. Still can't believe they built a 420 horsepower car and told everyone it made 390. Different time. If you've got six-pack stories, if your family had one, if you've still got one hidden in a barn somewhere, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We do this every week. More engines, more history, more stories about why the good stuff never lasts.